Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that rarely makes it into textbooks, but quietly shaped one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Ancient Rome liked to present itself as a civilization of law, order, and reason. Marble statues, straight roads, disciplined legions, and a legal system so influential that it still echoes through modern courts. But beneath that polished exterior existed a rigid social machine that left very little room for personal choice, especially for women. Marriage was not a romantic milestone. It was a civic duty, an economic transaction, and a political tool. For Roman women who refused it, the consequences were rarely dramatic in the way modern stories imagine, but they were often absolute, permanent, and quietly devastating. To understand what happened to Roman women who refused marriage, it is necessary to first understand what marriage meant in Roman society. Roman marriage was not primarily about love or companionship. It was about lineage, inheritance, and social stability. The Roman state depended on legitimate heirs to maintain property lines, citizenship roles, and military manpower. A woman's body was therefore viewed not as her own, but as a vessel through which Roman continuity flowed. From the earliest days of the Republic, Roman law treated women as legal minors for most of their lives. A woman passed from the authority of her father, known as patria potestas, to the authority of her husband. This authority was not symbolic, it was legal, financial, and social. A woman who rejected marriage was not merely rejecting a personal arrangement, she was disrupting an entire legal framework designed to control property and reproduction. In early Roman history, marriage was often enforced by family pressure rather than by direct state intervention. A daughter was expected to marry when her father arranged it. Refusal was rare, not because women lacked opinions, but because refusal had no recognized legal pathway. There was no formal mechanism for a woman to decline marriage if her paterfamilias demanded it. Disobedience could result in disinheritance, confinement, or social erasure. As Rome expanded and wealth concentrated among elite families, marriage became even more strategic. Alliances between powerful households were cemented through daughters. A woman who refused marriage could be seen as sabotaging her family's political future. In elite circles, this could destroy reputations overnight. Families that appeared unable to control their daughters were viewed as unstable, untrustworthy, and weak. By the late Republic, Rome began to face what its leaders perceived as a demographic crisis. Wars, civil conflict, and declining birth rates among the elite alarmed lawmakers. The response was not encouragement, but coercion. Marriage and childbirth became matters of state interest. Under Emperor Augustus, this coercion was codified into law. The Lex Julia and later the Lex Papae Papea imposed penalties on unmarried adults. These laws did not merely encourage marriage, they punished refusal. Women who remained unmarried beyond a certain age lost legal privileges. They could not inherit fully. They could not receive certain gifts. They were excluded from social benefits reserved for married women. A Roman woman who refused marriage under these laws was not arrested or executed. Instead, she was slowly stripped of legal relevance. Property rights were curtailed. Financial independence became difficult. Social standing declined. The punishment was bureaucratic, not theatrical, which made it far more effective. For wealthy women, refusal could result in forced guardianship. Roman law allowed women to manage property only under specific conditions. Unmarried women often found themselves placed under male guardians who controlled their finances. This meant that refusal of marriage did not lead to independence, it often led to a different form of control. In lower social classes, the consequences were more practical and immediate. An unmarried woman without family support faced economic vulnerability. Employment options were limited. Many trades were closed to women. Without a husband or male patron, Survival depended on informal labor, domestic service, or extended family charity. Religious life offered one of the few socially acceptable alternatives to marriage. The Vestal virgins are often cited as examples of empowered Roman women, but they were exceptions that proved the rule. Vestals were selected as children, required to remain celibate for decades, and lived under strict surveillance. Their privilege came at the cost of absolute control over their bodies and lives. Refusal of marriage was permitted only because their fertility was symbolically transferred to the state itself. For ordinary women, religious devotion did not offer the same protection. While some cults allowed female participation, they did not exempt women from social expectations. A woman could be pious and married. Piety was not a substitute for matrimony. Roman literature reveals deep anxiety about unmarried women. Satirists portrayed them as dangerous, immoral, or unnatural. Historians framed them as anomalies. The very concept of a woman choosing not to marry challenged Roman ideals of order and hierarchy. Choice itself was the problem. Yet, despite these pressures, some women did refuse marriage. Their stories survive only in fragments, in legal disputes, in hostile commentary, in inscriptions that hint at lives lived outside expectation. These women were not revolutionaries. They were individuals navigating a system designed to leave them no space. Some refused by delaying, others by claiming illness. Some relied on powerful family connections to shield them from consequences. A few inherited enough wealth to negotiate partial autonomy. But none escaped scrutiny. Refusal was never invisible. Roman society did not tolerate unmarried women existing on equal terms with married ones. The system was designed to reward compliance and punish division, not through spectacle, but through law, economics, and reputation. By the time Christianity began reshaping Roman values in the late Empire, the narrative shifted, but the pressure remained. Virginity gained spiritual prestige, but only within religious frameworks controlled by men. A woman refusing marriage for personal autonomy still had no recognized place. The story of Roman women who refused marriage is not a tale of rebellion crushed by violence. It is a story of quiet constraint, of laws written to limit options, of social norms enforced through inheritance and honor, of lives narrowed not by chains, but by contracts. And as Rome endured for centuries, this system proved remarkably stable. Empires fell, emperors died, but the expectation that women marry remained deeply embedded in Roman identity. This was not accidental, it was policy. As the Roman world moved deeper into the imperial era, the refusal of marriage became less visible but more tightly managed. The empire was vast, stretching from Britain to Syria, but the expectations placed on women remained strikingly consistent. A Roman woman's life was still measured through family structure, legitimacy, and household continuity. Refusing marriage was not treated as a single dramatic act. It was treated as an administrative disruption. In Rome, identity was legal before it was personal. Citizenship mattered, lineage mattered, household mattered. A woman's position was recorded through her father, her husband, or her guardian. Remaining unmarried meant existing outside the most common social classification system. This created complications not only for the woman herself, but for everyone connected to her. Augustan marriage laws continued to shape the social landscape for generations. These laws were built on incentives and penalties. Married women with children received privileges. Unmarried women lost rights gradually. Rome did not need to imprison women for refusing marriage. Rome simply made refusal economically impractical. One of the most significant consequences involved inheritance. Roman wealth was preserved through family lines, and marriage was a mechanism for distributing property in predictable ways. Under the legal penalties for remaining unmarried, a woman could be barred from receiving full inheritances unless she married within the expected time frame. This was not a moral punishment, It was a financial correction designed to pressure compliance. Elite families were especially sensitive to these rules. Senators and equestrians depended on carefully managed estates. A daughter refusing marriage could interfere with property transfers and alliance building. In response, families often used indirect force, not public violence, but private containment. A woman could be removed from social life, placed under constant supervision, or pressured until refusal became impossible. Roman guardianship laws made this easier. Even when women technically owned property, male guardians often held authority over transactions. An unmarried woman could find her legal independence reduced to a formality. Refusal of marriage did not mean freedom. It often meant trading one set of controls for another. Yet, Rome was not uniform. Social class determined how refusal played out. Among wealthy women, refusal could be managed through negotiated arrangements. A woman might remain unmarried but live within her natal household, protected by family status. In some cases, she could maintain influence through patronage, funding temples, public works, or social networks. Roman society allowed wealth to soften certain boundaries, though it never removed them. Among poorer women, refusal carried harsher practical outcomes. Marriage was often tied to economic survival. A household was a unit of labor. A woman without a husband or strong family support faced limited options. Work existed, but it was constrained. Domestic service, textile labor, small market trades, and informal economic roles were common. Refusal of marriage could lead to precarious dependence. Rome also maintained a strong cultural suspicion toward women who lived outside marriage. Writers often portrayed women as socially disruptive. Satire exaggerated them as greedy, manipulative, or unnatural. These portrayals were not objective descriptions, they were cultural tools. By framing unmarried women as abnormal, Roman society reinforced marriage as the default. The empire's obsession with household order extended into law enforcement, not through policing marriage directly, but through regulating morality, inheritance, and legitimacy. Children born outside recognized unions faced disadvantages. Families feared scandal. A woman refusing marriage could become the subject of rumor, which itself could destroy prospects for security. Refusal also intersected with politics. Imperial households were built on dynastic succession. Emperors needed heirs. Noble families needed connections. Women were central to this structure, even when denied formal power. A woman who refused marriage was refusing to participate in the machinery of empire. Some of the most famous women in Roman history navigated marriage strategically, using it as leverage rather than submission. But even these women rarely escaped marriage entirely. The system was too entrenched. Refusal was not a neutral choice. It was interpreted as resistance. One of the few socially acceptable alternatives remained religious dedication, though this was highly controlled. The Vestal virgins continued to serve as Rome's symbolic exception. They were granted privileges unavailable to other women, including independence from male guardianship. They could own property, make wills, and move through public life with unusual authority. But their freedom came at an institutional cost. They were bound to strict rules and severe consequences for breaking vows. Their role was not a path for ordinary women. It was a state-managed exception that reinforced the broader norm. Outside the Vestals, other religious roles existed, but they did not provide the same exemption. A woman could participate in cult life, festivals, and temple service, but she was still expected to marry unless her family arranged otherwise. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Rome faced shifting demographics, economic strain, and political instability. Marriage laws were still present, but enforcement varied. In some regions, local customs blended with Roman expectations. Provincial women might experience slightly different pressures depending on community norms. Yet the core Roman assumption remained: marriage was not optional. Unmarried women were often treated as incomplete citizens.
regardless of wealth or virtue. Their social role was undefined, which made them vulnerable. Roman society valued clarity: father, husband, children, household. Refusal disrupted that clarity. Even in death, inscriptions reveal the pattern. Tombstones emphasized marital status, motherhood, and family connection. A woman remembered without reference to husband or children was unusual. Memory itself was structured through marriage. The refusal of marriage therefore carried consequences beyond the living world. It affected legacy, commemoration, and social permanence. As Christianity grew in influence, a new framework emerged. Celibacy began to acquire spiritual prestige, particularly for women entering religious life. Virginity was reframed as devotion rather than defiance. But this shift did not create modern autonomy. It created a new institutional structure. Women could refuse marriage, but often only by entering a religious system controlled by male authorities. The form changed, the control remained. The Roman world was transforming, but the expectation that women belong within a regulated household endured. Marriage remained the empire's preferred solution to social order. Refusal remained an administrative problem to be corrected through law, economics, and reputation. And within this system, countless women lived lives that history barely recorded. Some complied, some delayed, some resisted quietly, some disappeared from documentation entirely. Rome did not need dramatic punishments. It relied on something more effective. A society designed so that refusal carried a cost at every step.
As the Roman Empire continued into its later centuries, the refusal of marriage became a subject that revealed the deeper mechanics of Roman control. The state rarely needed direct confrontation. Instead, it operated through a network of expectations so deeply embedded that resistance often appeared as silence rather than rebellion. Roman society was built around the household, and the household was built around reproduction, inheritance, and authority. A woman who refused marriage was not simply declining a partner, she was declining a legal position within the structure of Rome itself. This becomes clearer when examining how Roman law defined adulthood. For men, adulthood meant civic participation, military service, and independent legal standing. For women, adulthood was often defined through marital status. A woman was expected to transition from daughter to wife, and then, ideally, to mother. Each stage came with a socially recognized role. Refusal meant remaining in an undefined space, which Roman society treated as instability. The legal system reflected this. A Roman woman could not easily exist without a male legal anchor. Even when women gained certain property rights over time, guardianship remained a persistent mechanism. An unmarried woman might technically own wealth, but she often required a guardian's approval for major transactions. This meant that refusal of marriage could result in a life managed through constant oversight. Some women attempted to navigate this by using family strategy. In elite households, refusal could sometimes be disguised as delay. A woman might remain unmarried while serving as caretaker of an aging parent, managing household affairs, or maintaining family estates. This created a socially acceptable explanation that avoided open defiance. Yet delay was not freedom, it was a temporary suspension of expectation. Roman marriage pressure was strongest among the elite because elite marriages were political instruments. Senators arranged unions not for affection, but for alliances. A daughter refusing marriage threatened the family's access to power networks. In such cases, refusal could become a private crisis. Roman sources occasionally hint at women who resisted arranged marriages through withdrawal, illness claims, or appeals to religious devotion. These were not romantic acts of independence, they were survival tactics within a system that offered no formal right to refuse. One of the most striking features of Roman history is how rarely women's refusal appears directly in records. This absence is itself evidence. Rome recorded what it valued: contracts, heirs, marriages, legitimacy. Refusal was often erased through forced compliance or social disappearance. When refusal did surface, it often appeared in legal disputes. Inheritance conflicts sometimes reveal unmarried women caught between autonomy and coercion. A woman who remained unmarried might be accused of being manipulated by others or of disrupting family continuity. Courts tended to prioritize household stability over individual preference. In these disputes, the woman's refusal was rarely framed as choice, it was framed as disorder. The Roman state also reinforced marriage through honors granted to mothers. The jus trium liberum, or right of 3 children, rewarded women who produced multiple legitimate offspring. These women gained legal advantages, including greater independence from guardianship. This created a clear hierarchy: motherhood as civic contribution, unmarried status as civic failure. Women who refused marriage therefore faced not only penalties, but exclusion from honor. Roman culture also used public morality as an enforcement tool. Writers and officials treated marriage as a marker of virtue, regardless of personal reality. An unmarried woman could be subjected to gossip, suspicion, and social marginalization. Reputation was currency in Rome. For a woman, reputation determined marriage prospects, household respect, and family standing. Refusal risked being interpreted as arrogance, impropriety, or instability. Even when refusal was motivated for practical reasons, society rarely granted neutral interpretations. In the imperial court, these dynamics became even more intense. Imperial women were central to succession politics. Their marriages were matters of state. Refusal was almost unthinkable. Instead, imperial women were married strategically, sometimes repeatedly, to secure dynastic stability. Yet even within the court, some women sought alternatives through religious patronage or withdrawal from public life. They could not refuse marriage openly, but they could sometimes reshape their role within it. Outside the court, Roman provincial areas offered variations. In the eastern provinces, Greek traditions interacted with Roman law. Local customs sometimes allowed women slightly different social positioning. In Egypt, for example, documentary evidence suggests women had more visible economic rules. Yet Roman citizenship laws still imposed marriage expectations on those within the Roman legal framework. Refusal remained costly. By the 3rd century, Rome entered a period of crisis. Political instability, economic inflation, and external pressures reshaped daily life. Marriage enforcement laws weakened in practice, but social expectation remained strong. Rome did not need strict enforcement when culture itself enforced compliance. The rise of Christianity introduced a new ideological element. Christian communities began to value celibacy and virginity as spiritual ideals. This created a new category of unmarried woman, the consecrated virgin. For some women, this offered an escape from forced marriage. Religious life provided institutional legitimacy for refusal. But this was not modern independence. It was a shift from one form of authority to another. Women who refused marriage through Christian devotion were still expected to submit to ecclesiastical structures, vows, and male leadership. The refusal became acceptable only when redirected into approved channels. Over time, Roman society transitioned from pagan empire to Christian empire, but the underlying concern remained the same: regulating women's bodies, households, and reproduction for social stability. Marriage remained central, even as its religious meaning changed. The women who refused marriage in Rome, therefore, were not a unified group. Some were wealthy enough to negotiate partial autonomy. Some used religion as shelter. Some delayed until refusal became irrelevant. Many were pressured into compliance. Their lives reveal something fundamental about Rome. Rome was not sustained only by armies and emperors. It was sustained by households, contracts, inheritance lines, and the controlled reproduction of citizens. A woman refusing marriage challenged that system not through open revolution, but through absence, and Rome's response was consistent. Not spectacle, not drama,
but law, economics, and quiet social constraint.
As the Roman Empire moved toward its later centuries, the question of marriage became less about expansion and more about survival. Population decline, economic contraction, and political fragmentation forced Roman authorities to cling even more tightly to traditional social structures. Marriage was no longer just a cultural expectation, it was treated as a stabilizing force in a world that increasingly felt unstable. For women, this meant that refusal became even harder to justify. By the 4th century, Rome had changed dramatically. The old republican values had faded, emperors ruled through centralized power, and Christianity was no longer a marginal belief. Yet, despite these transformations, the underlying framework governing women's lives remained strikingly familiar. Marriage continued to function as a legal anchor. Roman law had evolved to grant women limited autonomy, especially widows and mothers. Some women could control property, manage estates, and sponsor public works. These cases are sometimes mistaken for evidence of widespread female independence. In reality, these freedoms were conditional and carefully bounded. They almost always followed marriage. A woman who had never married did not benefit from the same assumptions of respectability or stability. Widowhood could bring authority. Celibacy rarely did. Legal texts from the later empire show increasing concern with regulating private life. Laws addressed not only marriage, but sexual conduct, inheritance, and family obligation. Unmarried adults were viewed as social risks, particularly among the elite, where property fragmentation and succession disputes could weaken imperial administration. Refusal of marriage therefore intersected with state anxiety. Inscriptions from this period reveal how women were remembered. Funerary texts emphasized loyalty, fertility, and domestic virtue. Even educated women, patrons, and benefactors were praised primarily for fulfilling household roles. A woman remembered without reference to marriage stood out as unusual, sometimes even suspicious. Memory itself functioned as discipline. Christian moral frameworks altered the language of marriage, but not its centrality. Marriage was increasingly framed as a moral good, a regulated path that prevented disorder. Celibacy gained prestige, but only within religious institutions. Women who refused marriage without entering religious life occupied an increasingly narrow social space. Church leaders praised virginity, but they also reinforced obedience. Female sanctity was admired when it was controlled, supervised, and removed from secular influence. Independent refusal remained problematic. By this point, Roman society had developed two acceptable categories for women: wives and consecrated virgins. Both were defined by submission to authority, one to household leadership, the other to religious hierarchy. There was no recognized category for autonomous womanhood. Even aristocratic women who remained unmarried for extended periods often relied on familial framing to justify their status. They were daughters caring for parents, patrons managing estates temporarily, devotees preparing for religious life. Language softened refusal. Reality did not. In provincial regions, especially in the Western Empire, economic decline made marriage both more difficult and more necessary. Land ownership, taxation, and labor obligations increasingly centered around households. An unmarried woman without land or protection faced extreme vulnerability. Refusal could mean marginal existence. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed, its social assumptions had already embedded themselves into successor societies. Germanic kingdoms inherited Roman legal traditions and household structures. Marriage remained the organizing principle of female life. Roman ideas did not disappear, they transformed. The medieval world inherited Roman assumptions about women's roles, filtered through Christian doctrine. Marriage was still presented as duty. Virginity was still permitted only within controlled religious frameworks. Autonomy remained unrecognized. The women who refused marriage in Rome therefore left a legacy not through written manifestos, but through absence. Their choices exposed the limits of a system that defined citizenship, honor, and memory through marital status. Their refusal did not dismantle Roman society, but it revealed its boundaries. Rome could tolerate conquest, rebellion, and religious transformation. What it could not tolerate easily was social ambiguity. A woman who refused marriage introduced ambiguity, and Rome responded the only way it knew, by narrowing her options until refusal carried its own cost. This approach proved effective enough to outlive the empire itself. Centuries later, Western legal systems would still reflect Roman priorities: inheritance through marriage, legitimacy through unions, and social stability through regulated family life. The modern world often imagines ancient Rome as a place of excess and indulgence. In reality, it was a civilization obsessed with order. Marriage was one of its most important tools. And for women, refusing it was never a simple act. It was a negotiation with law, culture, economy, and memory. A negotiation that few could afford to lose.
The Roman Empire faded from political dominance. Its social logic did not vanish with it. The institutions that governed daily life, especially marriage and family structure, proved far more durable than emperors or borders. For women, the consequences of refusing marriage continued long after Rome itself ceased to exist as a unified state. Roman legal culture survived through transmission. In the Western territories, Roman law blended with Germanic custom. In the Eastern Empire, Roman administration endured for centuries. In both cases, marriage remained the cornerstone of female social identity. The Roman assumption that women belonged within regulated households became foundational to medieval governance. The legacy of Roman marriage pressure can be traced through early medieval legal codes. These systems inherited the idea that women required male guardianship unless defined through marriage or religious status. Unmarried women remained legally ambiguous figures, often grouped with minors or dependents. The Roman model persisted because it solved a problem every pre-modern society faced: control. Marriage controlled inheritance, it controlled reproduction, it controlled alliances, it controlled labor. For rulers, this made it indispensable. Women who refused marriage therefore remained exceptions, not models. In medieval Europe, religious life expanded as an alternative path for women. Convents offered protection, education, and relative autonomy. But this autonomy was conditional. It required vows, obedience, and removal from secular society. This was not a break from Roman thinking. It was its continuation. The Roman solution to refusal had always been institutional absorption, either into marriage or into structured devotion. Personal autonomy outside systems of control remained unacceptable. Throughout the Middle Ages, unmarried women outside religious life often lived precariously. Some worked as artisans, healers, or traders, but their social position was fragile. Without household protection, they were vulnerable to legal suspicion and economic instability. These patterns were not accidental, they were inherited. Roman law had normalized the idea that a woman's legitimacy derived from her placement within an approved structure. Medieval law reinforced it, early modern law refined it. Even as societies changed, the underlying assumption remained. Marriage was presented as one option among many. It was presented as order itself. By the early modern period, Western societies began recording women's lives more systematically. Census records, parish registers, and legal documents tracked marital status closely. Unmarried women were categorized, regulated, and often taxed differently. This administrative focus had Roman roots. Rome pioneered the idea that marital status was a civic concern. That idea never fully disappeared. In the modern era, legal reforms gradually expanded women's rights. Property ownership, contractual capacity, and civic participation became possible without marriage. but cultural expectations lagged behind legal change. The long shadow of Roman marriage ideology remained visible. Unmarried women were often portrayed as incomplete, unstable, or deviant well into the 19th and 20th centuries. These portrayals echoed ancient Roman anxieties almost word for word. History rarely moves as cleanly as textbooks suggest. The Roman world did not invent marriage, but it perfected its use as a regulatory system. By tying legal privilege, economic stability, and social honor to marital status, Rome created a model that later societies found useful, and so they preserved it. The women who refused marriage in ancient Rome were not remembered as pioneers. They were rarely remembered at all. Their lives disrupted records rather than filling them. They did not leave monuments. They left gaps. Yet those gaps tell a story. They reveal how power operates most effectively not through punishment, but through structure. Not through violence, but through incentives. Not through spectacle, but through normalization. Rome did not need to ask women whether they wanted to marry. It built a world where refusal made little sense. That world survived Rome itself. Even today, modern societies continue to debate marriage, autonomy, and social expectation. The language has changed, the laws have changed, but the underlying tension remains familiar. Choice versus structure. Individual desire versus social order. In ancient Rome, that tension played out quietly in households, contracts, and legal texts. Women who refused marriage did not ignite revolutions. They navigated constraints, sometimes successfully, often invisibly. Their story is not dramatic, it is systematic, and that is precisely why it matters. As the centuries moved forward, the Roman model of marriage as social infrastructure continued to echo through Western civilization in ways that were often unnoticed. Rome's greatest influence was not only in roads, aqueducts, or armies, but in the quiet legal assumptions that shaped everyday life. Marriage became one of Rome's most enduring exports. The Roman Empire linked marriage to citizenship, inheritance, legitimacy, and order. Later European societies inherited these priorities almost automatically. Even when they rejected Roman religion or political structure, they retained Roman domestic logic. For women, this meant that refusal of marriage remained culturally complicated long after Roman law itself faded from direct enforcement. In early modern Europe, unmarried women were frequently categorized through dependency. The language differed by region, but the assumption was consistent. A woman was expected to belong to a household led by a father, husband, or religious institution. This expectation was not natural. It was historical. It was constructed through centuries of legal tradition, much of it shaped by Roman precedent. As Western societies entered the age of revolutions and industrialization, women's labor became more visible outside the household. Factories, offices, and urban economies created new possibilities, yet cultural narratives remained slow to adjust. Marriage continued to function as the default social destination. Unmarried women were often treated as transitional figures, assumed to be waiting for marriage rather than choosing against it. This assumption mirrored Rome's inability to conceptualize refusal as a stable identity. The Roman pattern persisted. Refusal was treated as temporary, suspicious, or incomplete. In the 19th century, legal reforms began expanding women's rights. Property laws shifted, guardianship rules weakened, education opportunities grew, yet marriage remained central to social legitimacy. The concept of the respectable woman was still closely tied to marital status. This respectability framework had ancient roots. Rome had associated female virtue with domestic order. Later societies inherited the association,
even when the surrounding moral language changed. By the 20th century, women's autonomy increased dramatically in law and practice, yet cultural pressure did not vanish. Marriage remained a powerful marker of social belonging. Unmarried women were often framed through stereotypes, much as Roman satire had framed them centuries earlier. The form changed, the structure remained. Rome's legacy was not that women could not refuse marriage. Some always did. The legacy was that refusal carried social cost because marriage was treated as an organizing principle rather than a personal choice. This is what made Roman marriage policies so influential. It turned private life into civic duty. The Roman state did not merely encourage marriage, it embedded marriage into the machinery of privilege. Taxation, inheritance, guardianship, and public honor all revolved around it. Modern societies no longer enforce marriage through imperial law, but cultural inheritance is subtle. Social expectations often outlast formal rules. The Roman world understood something fundamental. Control works best when it feels normal. Women who refused marriage in Rome were confronting not a single institution, but an entire worldview. A worldview in which household continuity mattered more than individual preference. That worldview survived through medieval law, early modern custom, and modern cultural residue. The women themselves remain mostly unnamed. Their stories are rarely preserved in full, but their existence is still visible in the structure of the society that constrained them. Rome's obsession with marriage was not about romance. It was about governance. It was about inheritance. It was about citizenship. It was about stability. Refusal, therefore, became a quiet form of disruption, not because it was loud, but because it exposed the dependency of the system. A system that required women to be placed, categorized, and controlled. In the end, what happened to Roman women who refused marriage was rarely recorded as a single outcome. There was no universal punishment, no consistent dramatic finale. Instead, there was a pattern: economic penalties, legal limitations, social suspicion, institutional absorption, cultural erasure. Rome did not destroy these women. It simply made refusal difficult enough that most could not sustain it. And that quiet strategy became one of Rome's most enduring social technologies.
As Roman influence continued to shape the foundations of Western civilization, the social logic surrounding women and marriage became increasingly invisible. What began as explicit law slowly transformed into assumed custom. By this stage, refusal of marriage was no longer openly debated. It was quietly marginalized. In late antiquity and the early medieval period, Roman administrative thinking merged with emerging feudal systems. Authority became localized, but household structure remained central. Land, labor, and loyalty revolved around family units. Marriage provided the framework through which these units were maintained. Women without husbands were difficult to place. They did not fit neatly into feudal hierarchies built on inheritance and obligation. As a result, refusal of marriage was often absorbed into dependency. An unmarried woman lived under the protection of a male relative, religious house, or patron. Autonomy without attachment remained rare. This pattern mirrored Rome's solution centuries earlier. Marriage was not simply encouraged, it was assumed. Legal texts from early medieval Europe show that unmarried women were often classified alongside widows and minors, even when fully capable of managing affairs. The assumption was not incapacity, but instability. A woman without a household head was viewed as lacking a clear social function. Roman thought had normalized this perspective. Even as Christianity promoted spiritual equality in theory,
Institutional practice reinforced hierarchy. Women who refused marriage for religious reasons were accepted only when they submitted to communal discipline. Personal refusal without institutional alignment remained socially disruptive. Over time, the language surrounding marriage softened, but its role did not. Marriage became framed as natural order rather than legal obligation. This reframing made pressure harder to detect and harder to resist. When refusal is treated as deviation from nature rather than resistance to policy, enforcement becomes cultural rather than legal. Rome had perfected this transition. By the early modern period, marriage was deeply entwined with morality, economics, and governance. Refusal was possible, but it came with expectations of explanation. A woman who did not marry was expected to justify her status through service, piety, or dependency. Silence was rarely permitted. In this way, the Roman legacy continued to shape social narratives. Women's lives were still measured through relational status. Identity was constructed through belonging rather than choice. Even when unmarried women achieved influence, their authority was often framed as exceptional rather than normal. They were patrons, mystics, caretakers, or benefactors. Their legitimacy depended on framing that reassured society they were not rejecting order itself. This mirrors how Rome treated its exceptions. Rome allowed exceptions when they reinforced the system, not when they challenged it. By the early modern era, economic changes created new social categories. Urbanization and wage labor allowed some women to live independently, yet cultural suspicion followed them. Unmarried women were often associated with disorder, instability, or moral ambiguity. These associations did not appear spontaneously. They were inherited. Roman satire had portrayed unmarried women as problematic. Medieval moralists echoed similar themes. Early modern commentators repeated them with new language. The continuity is striking. Across centuries, refusal of marriage was framed not as preference, but problem. Rome's influence lay not in coercion alone, but in narrative. It shaped how societies talked about women, family, and order. Once these narratives became internalized, enforcement required no law at all. The women themselves adapted. Some negotiated space quietly. Some accepted dependency as protection. Some disappeared into institutions. Some resisted in ways history did not record. What remains is not a catalog of dramatic defiance, but a pattern of constrained choice. Rome did not eliminate refusal. It rendered it socially inefficient. That inefficiency discouraged repetition, and so the system sustained itself. The modern world often imagines progress as linear, but social structures persist through adaptation. Roman marriage ideology adapted repeatedly, surviving empire collapse, religious transformation, and economic revolution. Its core assumption endured, that women's stability was achieved through placement within approved structures. Refusal, by contrast, introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty has always been something societies seek to manage.
By the time Roman social logic had fully merged into medieval and early modern European life, the original laws that once punished unmarried women were rarely cited directly. Their function had been absorbed into habit. What had once been explicit policy became assumed reality. Marriage no longer needed to be enforced aggressively, because society itself now enforced it through expectation. This transformation marked one of Rome's most effective long-term influences. In Roman society, marriage had been a mechanism for maintaining order. Over centuries, this mechanism evolved into a cultural reflex. Women were expected to marry not because a statute demanded it, but because everything around them was structured as though they would. Economic systems, inheritance practices, housing arrangements, and moral narratives all assumed female participation in marriage.
Refusal did not disappear, it became quieter. In early modern cities, records show women living alone, working in trades, managing small businesses, or serving as household heads. These women were not legally forbidden from remaining unmarried, yet their independence was often provisional. Without marriage, their security depended on fragile networks of employment, patronage, or kinship. The Roman idea that marriage stabilized society still guided perception. Unmarried women were tolerated when they were useful, invisible, or temporary. They were scrutinized when they appeared permanent. This distinction mattered. Roman society had always been comfortable with exceptions that did not multiply. A woman who remained unmarried briefly or for a clear institutional reason could be accommodated. A woman who lived her entire life outside marriage, without religious enclosure or male oversight, challenged inherited assumptions. These assumptions shaped law indirectly. In many European societies, unmarried women faced restrictions on property management, legal testimony, or civic participation well into the modern era. These restrictions were rarely justified as punishment. They were framed as protection, stability, or tradition. Rome had used similar language. Protection had always been the preferred justification for control. By the 18th and 19th centuries, industrialization introduced new pressures. Urban labor markets created opportunities for women to earn wages independently. This development strained older household models. Women could now survive without marriage more visibly than before. Yet cultural pressure intensified. Unmarried women were increasingly categorized through social labels that framed them as incomplete or transitional. The assumption persisted that marriage was the natural conclusion of female life. Refusal was interpreted as failure, misfortune, or deviation. This framing was not invented in the modern period. It echoed Roman discourse. Roman writers had portrayed unmarried women as out of place within the social order. Later societies inherited the same discomfort, even when they no longer remembered its origin. The endurance of this discomfort reveals how deeply Roman marriage logic had embedded itself. Marriage was not only a personal arrangement, it was a way of sorting people into predictable roles. It reduced ambiguity, it clarified inheritance, it stabilized labor and care obligations. Women who refused marriage disrupted these functions. They introduced uncertainty into systems designed to minimize it. As modern legal systems gradually removed explicit penalties for remaining unmarried, social narratives continued to carry the burden of enforcement. Literature, moral instruction, and popular commentary reinforced the idea that marriage was fulfillment rather than structure. This shift in language made refusal harder to articulate. In Rome, refusal was visible as defiance of expectation. In modern societies, refusal was reframed as absence of fulfillment. The mechanism changed, but the outcome remained similar. Women were still encouraged to justify their choice. The Roman system had required women to justify refusal through religion or family service. Modern societies required justification through career, caregiving, or circumstance. Choice was tolerated when it could be explained. Silence was not. This continuity highlights an important feature of Roman influence. Rome did not merely regulate behavior, it shaped categories of thought. It taught societies how to interpret deviation. Marriage became synonymous with order. Refusal became synonymous with explanation. Throughout history, women who refused marriage adapted strategically. They built networks, cultivated skills, and negotiated space within constrained systems. Their lives were often practical rather than ideological. They were not always resisting marriage as an institution. They were responding to specific circumstances. Rome had never been concerned with motive, only with outcome. A woman's reason for refusing marriage mattered less than the structural consequences of her refusal. This perspective survived Rome. Societies continued to evaluate women's choices based on how they fit into existing systems. In the 20th century, feminist movements challenged these inherited structures directly. Marriage was re-examined as a social institution rather than a natural destiny. Legal reforms expanded women's autonomy dramatically. Yet even as law changed, cultural residue remained. Marriage continued to function as a benchmark of adulthood, stability, and legitimacy.
Unmarried women were increasingly visible, but often still explained through narrative frameworks that emphasized compensation rather than choice. This reflects the long reach of Roman normalization. Rome had never needed universal compliance, it needed majority participation. As long as most women married, the system functioned. Exceptions could be managed, absorbed, or ignored. Modern societies operate similarly. Marriage is no longer mandatory, but it remains structurally advantageous in many contexts. Tax systems, healthcare access, housing markets, and social recognition often still reward married households. This is not accidental, it is inheritance. The Roman Empire understood that institutions endure when they align personal incentives with social order. Marriage did exactly that. It rewarded conformity and penalized deviation without constant enforcement. Women who refused marriage in Rome experienced this reality directly. Their lives were shaped not by a single law, but by a network of consequences that touched every aspect of existence. That network did not disappear with Rome. It evolved. The story of Roman women who refused marriage, therefore, is not confined to antiquity. It is a foundational chapter in a much longer narrative about how societies manage gender, autonomy, and order. Rome's greatest achievement in this area was not repression, it was design. A system so coherent that refusal became costly without appearing violent. A system that outlived emperors, armies, and borders. A system that still echoes in subtle ways today. The women themselves remain largely unnamed, but their presence can be traced in legal gaps, cultural anxieties, and institutional compromises across centuries. Their refusal did not dismantle Rome's social order.
As societies moved fully into the modern age, the influence of Roman marriage logic became increasingly indirect, yet no less powerful. What once existed as formal legal pressure had transformed into cultural architecture. Marriage no longer needed to be mandated because institutions were already built around it. Women who refused marriage entered environments that assumed their eventual compliance, even when laws no longer demanded it. This assumption did not arise naturally. It was inherited. Roman civilization had treated marriage as a public concern. This framing survived through medieval canon law, early modern civil codes, and eventually into the bureaucratic systems of modern states. Census categories, tax structures, housing policies, and social benefits continued to rely on marital status as an organizing principle. In this way, refusal of marriage remained visible not as a crime, but as an anomaly that systems struggled to classify. The Roman approach had always relied on classification. Citizens were categorized by status, household, and lineage. Women were categorized through relational identity. This logic persisted even when women gained formal legal independence. Modern legal systems removed explicit penalties for remaining unmarried, but administrative practices often retained marriage as the default assumption. Forms asked for marital status. Benefits were calculated through household models. Social recognition followed similar patterns. Marriage remained a shortcut for legitimacy. Women who refused marriage had to navigate these structures carefully. Their independence was often conditional on navigating systems designed for couples. Financial planning, housing access, and caregiving arrangements all reflected assumptions about marital life. This created friction, not hostility, but inefficiency. Rome had always treated inefficiency as a corrective force. When refusal made life harder, compliance increased naturally. This principle continued to operate in subtler forms. Cultural narratives reinforced it. Popular media, literature, and social commentary frequently framed unmarried women through stories of absence rather than presence. They were depicted as waiting, compensating, or substituting. Career success, independence, or community involvement were often portrayed as alternatives rather than complete lives. This framing echoed Roman thought. In Roman culture, marriage was completeness. Refusal required explanation. Later societies adopted similar language even as moral frameworks shifted. The result was continuity. Across centuries, women who refused marriage were rarely allowed to exist without interpretation. Their lives were rarely treated as neutral. They were contextualized, explained, and categorized. This pattern reveals how deeply Roman social engineering succeeded. Rome had not needed universal enforcement, it needed durability. By embedding marriage into systems of reward and recognition, it ensured long-term compliance without constant coercion. Women who refused marriage in Rome experienced this directly. They faced economic penalties, legal limitations, and social marginalization. Their refusal was never illegal in isolation. It became costly through accumulation. Later societies refined this approach. Cost replaced punishment. Expectation replaced enforcement. In the modern era, the cost of refusal is often described as social pressure rather than legal restriction. Yet pressure operates through structures inherited from earlier systems. Marriage still organizes caregiving expectations. Married women are often assumed to receive support from partners. Unmarried women are expected to self-manage or compensate through networks. This assumption traces back to Roman household logic. The Roman household was not just a family unit, it was an economic engine. Labor, care, and authority flowed through it. Women outside households disrupted this flow. Modern societies still rely on household-based distribution of labor and care. Marriage remains a convenient mechanism for assigning responsibility. Refusal complicates this assignment. That complication often results in informal penalties. Roman society responded to complication by narrowing options. Modern societies respond by normalizing certain life paths over others. The effect is similar. Women who refuse marriage often find themselves navigating systems not designed with them in mind. This doesn't prevent refusal, it shapes its experience. The Roman legacy is visible here. Rome did not eliminate alternatives, it made them less efficient. This strategy proved remarkably resilient. Even as gender roles evolved, marriage retained symbolic power. It remained associated with stability, adulthood, and social legitimacy. Refusal was often framed as temporary or exceptional. The language softened, the structure endured. This endurance highlights a broader truth about Roman influence. Rome's most lasting contributions were not monuments or military strategies, they were frameworks for organizing human behavior. Marriage was one of those frameworks. It linked private life to public order. It aligned personal relationships with state interests. It provided predictability. Women who refused marriage challenged predictability. Rome responded by designing systems that discouraged unpredictability. Those systems were passed down, adapted, and normalized. The women themselves rarely left records explaining their choices. History records them indirectly, through legal anomalies, social commentary, and institutional responses. Yet their presence mattered. They revealed the limits of systems that depended on compliance. They exposed the work required to maintain order. Their refusal forced societies to respond, sometimes through law, sometimes through narrative, sometimes through silence. The silence is particularly telling. Rome did not celebrate unmarried women. Later societies rarely did either. Visibility was reserved for roles that reinforced social structure. Marriage produced visibility. Refusal produced obscurity. This imbalance shaped memory. Historical narratives focus on wives, mothers, queens, and religious figures. Unmarried women appear less frequently, not because they did not exist, but because systems were not designed to remember them. Memory followed structure. Rome understood this. It tied honor, commemoration, and legacy to household roles. Tomb inscriptions emphasized marital status and offspring. Later societies continued similar practices. Unmarried women were harder to situate within collective memory. Their lives were often recorded only when they intersected with institutions.
This pattern continues in subtle ways. Modern recognition often still centers on family milestones. Marriage announcements, anniversaries, and family narratives dominate social recognition. Refusal exists, but it does not anchor collective storytelling. This is not accidental. It reflects inherited priorities. The Roman Empire did not invent these priorities, but it refined them and embedded them deeply. Women who refused marriage in Rome lived within a system that treated their choice as deviation rather than identity. That framing persisted. Even as societies modernized, refusal remained something to be contextualized. This continuity suggests that social change operates incrementally. Legal reform alone does not dismantle inherited frameworks. Cultural architecture persists. The Roman model demonstrates how effectively culture can enforce norms without overt force. Marriage became a default setting. Refusal required navigation. This navigation shaped women's lives across centuries. Some succeeded in carving space. Some accepted compromise. Some were absorbed into institutions. Some disappeared from record. Their experiences varied, but the underlying structure remained consistent. Rome's influence is visible not in individual outcomes, but in systemic patterns. Patterns of expectation, patterns of reward, patterns of recognition. The refusal of marriage challenged these patterns, but did not dismantle them. Instead, it revealed their strength. The story of Roman women who refused marriage is therefore not a story of failure or triumph. It is a study in how societies design compliance. Rome designed a world in which marriage felt inevitable. That world survived Rome itself, and its legacy continues to shape how refusal is understood, managed, and remembered today.
By the time modern societies began to articulate individual rights more explicitly, the Roman inheritance had already done its work. Marriage was no longer openly defended as a tool of governance, yet it continued to operate as one. The structure remained intact even as the justification evolved. What had once been described as civic duty became framed as personal fulfillment, social maturity, or natural progression. This shift in language did not weaken the system. It strengthened it. Rome had relied on law to enforce marriage because law was necessary in a society still defining its institutions. Later societies relied on internalization. By presenting marriage as aspiration rather than obligation, pressure became less visible and therefore more resilient. Women who refused marriage now encountered a different kind of resistance, not prohibition, expectation. This expectation was built into nearly every layer of social organization. Education systems assumed eventual family formation. Workplace policies often presumed spousal support. Housing markets favored coupled households. Social rituals centered around marriage milestones. None of this required explicit reference to Rome, yet the logic was unmistakably Roman. Marriage continued to function as a sorting mechanism. It categorized adults into predictable roles and relationships. It simplified responsibility. It stabilized resource distribution. These were the same functions marriage served in ancient Rome. Women who refused marriage disrupted these functions, not dramatically, incrementally. Their refusal exposed how much modern life still relied on assumptions inherited from earlier eras. In Rome, unmarried women were treated as administrative complications. In modern societies, they are often treated as statistical anomalies. Systems accommodate them, but rarely prioritize them. Their needs are addressed reactively rather than proactively. This pattern mirrors Roman practice. Rome did not eliminate unmarried women, it designed systems around married ones. The same design principle persists. As women's participation in public life expanded, marriage adapted rather than disappeared. Dual-income households became normalized. Marriage shifted from purely economic alliance to partnership narrative, yet the underlying structure remained. Marriage still organized legitimacy. Women who refused it continued to exist outside the dominant framework. This did not prevent success, it shaped recognition. Modern narratives often frame unmarried women through achievement as compensation. Professional success, independence, or contribution is frequently presented as alternative fulfillment. The implication remains that marriage is the baseline against which other paths are measured. Rome had done the same. In Roman culture, marriage defined completeness. Other roles were secondary. Religious devotion, patronage, or caretaking were acceptable alternatives only when framed as service rather than autonomy. This framing survived centuries. Even today, refusal of marriage is often explained through productivity. Contribution becomes justification. Autonomy alone is rarely treated as sufficient explanation. This reflects a long cultural memory. Rome taught societies to evaluate women's lives through their utility to social order. Marriage was the most efficient expression of that utility. Refusal required demonstration of alternative value. The durability of this logic explains why marriage remains culturally central even when no longer legally required. It has become embedded in identity formation. People are taught to imagine their futures through relational milestones. Marriage occupies a central position in this imagination. Refusal disrupts narrative coherence. Societies respond to narrative disruption by reinterpreting it. This reinterpretation can take many forms. Unmarried women may be framed as independent, modern, or unconventional. These labels appear positive, but they still mark deviation. They still signal difference. Rome used similar signaling. Unmarried women were not invisible. They were visible as exceptions. Their exceptionality reinforced the norm. This mechanism persists. Exception does not dismantle structure. It stabilizes it. The Roman system endured because it tolerated limited deviation without changing its core assumptions. Modern societies often operate the same way. Marriage remains dominant not because alternatives are forbidden, but because alternatives are framed as variations rather than equivalences. This framing has consequences. It influences policy design, it shapes workplace expectations, it affects social support structures. Married households are often treated as default units of analysis. Unmarried women must adapt. Adaptation requires labor. Rome imposed that labor intentionally. Modern societies inherit it unconsciously. The women who refused marriage in Rome navigated systems that offered no neutral space. Their choices were always interpreted. Their lives were always situated relative to marriage. That relative positioning persists today. Even as language becomes more inclusive, structural assumptions remain slow to change. Institutions evolve incrementally. Cultural memory lags behind legal reform. Rome's influence is visible in this lag. Rome did not simply regulate marriage, it normalized it as social architecture. That architecture proved adaptable across centuries. It survived empire collapse. It survived religious transformation. It survived industrialization. It survives now. The story of Roman women who refused marriage therefore does not conclude with Rome's fall. It extends into every society that inherited Roman domestic logic. Their refusal highlights how deeply embedded certain assumptions are. Marriage is often described as personal choice, yet its structural role reveals otherwise. It organizes resources, responsibilities, and recognition. Refusal challenges organization. Systems respond by redirecting, reframing, or absorbing refusal rather than eliminating it. This response pattern is Roman. The Roman state understood that stability required predictability. Marriage provided predictability. Women's refusal threatened it. Rather than confront refusal directly, Rome designed environments where refusal was inconvenient. That strategy proved extraordinarily effective. It became tradition. It became culture. It became invisible. Today, refusal of marriage is more common and more accepted than at any point in history, yet its experience is still shaped by inherited structures. Unmarried women navigate systems designed for married ones. They negotiate assumptions rather than laws. They encounter expectation rather than prohibition. This is the modern expression of an ancient pattern. Rome's legacy lies not in the control of individual lives, but in the shaping of collective defaults. Those defaults continue to influence how lives are planned, evaluated, and remembered. The women who refused marriage in Rome lived at the edge of these defaults. Their choices revealed the system's contours. Those contours remain, and as long as marriage continues to function as a central organizing principle, refusal will continue to illuminate the architecture beneath social life, not as rebellion, but as contrast.
As the long arc of history unfolds, The persistence of Roman social logic becomes most visible not in moments of crisis, but in moments of normalization. What endures longest is not what is enforced loudly, but what is quietly assumed. Marriage, as Rome shaped it, became one of those assumptions. By the time societies reached the modern period, the Roman framework no longer felt inherited, it felt natural. This sense of naturalness masked its origins. In Roman society, marriage had been a solution to a problem of governance. It organized inheritance, stabilized households, and ensured continuity. Over time, that solution was absorbed into culture so completely that its administrative function faded from view. What remained was the expectation itself. Women who refused marriage continued to exist within this expectation. Their refusal no longer triggered legal penalties in most societies, but it still interacted with systems designed around marital norms. These systems included property ownership patterns, caregiving responsibilities, social recognition, and even time itself. Life stages were measured through marital progression. Childhood led to adulthood. Adulthood was marked by marriage. Marriage was followed by parenthood. Refusal disrupted this timeline. Disruption required reinterpretation. Modern societies developed new narratives to accommodate this disruption without dismantling the structure. Unmarried women were described as independent, career-focused, unconventional, or modern. These descriptions appeared progressive, yet they preserved an underlying distinction. Marriage remained the reference point. This distinction echoed Roman classification. In Rome, women who refused marriage were not outside society. They were positioned differently within it. Their difference reinforced the norm by contrast. Later societies adopted the same mechanism with updated language. Difference became identity. Identity became explanation. Explanation maintained structure. This process reveals how deeply Roman thinking influenced not only law, but social cognition. Rome trained societies to think in terms of roles rather than choices. A woman's value was interpreted through her placement within a system. Marriage provided placement. Refusal required reclassification. Even as women gained unprecedented autonomy in the 20th and 21st centuries, this classificatory impulse persisted. Systems adapted, but they did not dissolve. Marriage remained a key variable in policy analysis, demographic studies, and social planning. This persistence was not ideological, it was practical. Institutions favor predictability. Marriage offers predictability. It creates households with assumed patterns of support, care, and resource sharing. Women who refuse marriage do not invalidate these patterns, but they complicate them. Rome had always responded to complication by encouraging conformity through convenience. Modern societies often do the same. Rather than restrict refusal, they make marriage easier to navigate than its alternatives. Legal benefits, social rituals, and economic incentives subtly reinforce participation. Refusal remains possible, but it requires more negotiation. This negotiation shapes experience. Women who refuse marriage often become adept at managing systems not built for them. They construct alternative networks of support. They redefine family. They adapt. Adaptation, however, is labor. Rome imposed that labor deliberately. Later societies inherited it unconsciously. The endurance of this pattern suggests that social change does not erase structure so much as layer upon it. New freedoms coexist with old frameworks. Autonomy expands, but expectations linger. The Roman model survives not because it is defended, but because it is embedded. This embeddedness explains why discussions of marriage continue to evoke strong cultural resonance. Marriage is treated more than a contract, it is treated as a marker of legitimacy, stability, and adulthood. These associations are historical, they were cultivated. Rome linked marriage to citizenship and honor. Later societies linked it to morality and fulfillment. The link changed form, but not function. Women who refused marriage challenged this function by existing visibly outside it.
Their visibility exposes the scaffolding beneath social norms. This exposure is often uncomfortable. Societies respond by normalizing the refusal as exception rather than alternative. Language emphasizes choice, but structure emphasizes continuity. This duality allows systems to absorb change without reconfiguration. Rome mastered this balance. It allowed exceptions while preserving the rule. It rewarded participation while tolerating deviation. It framed marriage as order rather than obligation. These strategies ensured longevity. The women who refused marriage in Rome experienced the earliest version of this design. Their lives were shaped by constraints that did not announce themselves as punishment. They were shaped by access, recognition, and memory. These forces continue to operate. Recognition remains uneven. Stories of women's lives are still often framed around marital status. Even when celebrating independence, narratives frequently reference marriage implicitly as absence or contrast. Memory follows structure. Rome understood that memory reinforces order. By tying commemoration to household roles, it ensured that marriage-centered lives were remembered most clearly. Unmarried lives faded more easily. This pattern persists. Public recognition often still prioritizes family narratives. Individual lives outside these narratives require explanation or framing. Explanation signals difference. Difference stabilizes norms. The Roman legacy lies here, not in explicit rules, but in patterned thought. Not in prohibition, but in preference. Not in force, but in design. Women who refused marriage continue to illuminate this design simply by existing. Their lives reveal how systems allocate attention, support, and legitimacy. They show where assumptions still operate. They show how deeply history shapes the present. The Roman Empire no longer governs territory, but its domestic logic remains influential. Marriage still organizes social life in ways that feel intuitive rather than imposed. That intuition has a history. It was built, it was maintained, it was transmitted, and it continues to shape experience. The story of Roman women who refused marriage, therefore, is not confined to antiquity. It is an ongoing narrative about how societies manage choice within structure. Refusal does not collapse systems, it tests them. Rome passed that test by designing systems that endured. Modern societies continue to live within those designs. And as long as marriage remains a central organizing principle, the quiet legacy of Roman social engineering will remain present, shaping not only what is expected, but what is remembered.
By the time the modern world began to describe itself as post-traditional, the Roman framework surrounding marriage had already achieved something rare in history. It had become so deeply embedded that it no longer appeared as inheritance, it appeared as common sense. This transformation marked the final stage of Rome's social influence, invisibility. In ancient Rome, marriage was overtly political. It secured heirs, stabilized property, and ensured continuity. Women were placed within this structure as a matter of necessity rather than preference. Refusal was treated as disruption. Over centuries, this logic softened in language but not in effect. What had once been law became expectation. What had once been enforcement became assumption. The disappearance of explicit coercion did not dismantle the system, it perfected it. Modern societies often frame marriage as optional, yet still organize life as though it were central. Administrative systems, economic planning, and social rituals continue to revolve around partnered households. Women who refuse marriage encounter these systems not as barriers, but as environments that quietly presume participation. This presumption shapes outcomes. Access to housing, healthcare, caregiving support, and social legitimacy often aligns more easily with marital structures. Refusal remains possible, but it requires adjustment. Adjustment requires effort. Effort functions as deterrence. Rome understood deterrence. The Roman state rarely needed to punish refusal directly. It only needed to ensure that refusal was inconvenient.
That lesson endured. Modern societies often replicate it unintentionally, preserving a structure long after its rationale has been forgotten. This is how cultural systems survive. They detach from their origins and attach to routine. Women who refuse marriage today may not experience the same legal restrictions faced by Roman women, but they often navigate comparable patterns of explanation and accommodation. Their lives are interpreted in relation to marriage, not independently of it. The question of why remains implicit even when never asked. This interpretive reflex traces back to Rome's insistence on categorization. Roman society categorized women through relationship status. That categorization simplified governance. It reduced ambiguity. It organized responsibility. Later societies inherited this impulse, embedding it into statistical models, policy frameworks, and social narratives. Marriage became a variable. Refusal became deviation. Deviation required narrative management. Rome pioneered narrative management as a form of governance. Writers, moralists, and lawmakers reinforced ideals that aligned with structural needs. Unmarried women were portrayed as exceptional, temporary, or peripheral. These portrayals reinforced the centrality of marriage without overt force. Centuries later, similar portrayals persist under different names. Independence is praised, but often framed as substitute rather than standard. Autonomy is accepted, but rarely treated as default. Marriage remains the baseline against which alternatives are measured. This measurement does not imply hostility, it implies priority. Priority shapes policy. Priority shapes memory. The Roman Empire understood that memory was a tool of order. What societies remember determines what they repeat. By tying honor and commemoration to marriage and family roles, Rome ensured that these roles dominated historical record. Unmarried women existed, but their lives were harder to memorialize within existing frameworks. This pattern extended beyond Rome. Medieval chronicles, early modern records, and even modern biographies often foreground marital status as a defining feature. Memory followed structure. Structure followed Rome. The long continuity of this pattern reveals that the story of Roman women who refused marriage is not one of suppression alone, it is a story of design. Rome designed systems that favored certain life paths and quietly deprioritized others. That design proved adaptable. It survived religious change by reframing marriage as moral necessity. It survived economic change by reframing marriage as partnership. It survived legal reform by reframing marriage as choice. Each reframing preserved function while altering justification. Women who refused marriage exposed the adaptability of this system. Their lives forced societies to respond without dismantling foundational assumptions. The response was rarely prohibition, it was reinterpretation. Reinterpretation allowed continuity. Rome's influence therefore lies less in what it forbade and more in what it normalized. Marriage became normal. Refusal became notable. Not notable enough to prevent, but notable enough to frame. Framing shapes experience. Women who refuse marriage often construct lives that do not align with dominant narratives. Their success, stability, or fulfillment may be recognized but often as individual achievement rather than standard outcome. This distinction reinforces the sense that marriage remains the primary template. Templates are powerful. They guide expectation. They influence aspiration. They shape policy. The Roman template for women's social placement proved resilient because it aligned personal life with institutional needs. Marriage simplified governance. That simplicity remained attractive to every society that followed. Even as values shifted, simplicity endured. The story of Roman women who refused marriage therefore serves as a lens through which to understand broader patterns of social organization. It reveals how societies balance individual choice with collective structure. It shows how norms persist, not through force, but through design. Rome mastered design. Its systems were efficient, adaptable, and durable. They shaped not only behavior, but perception.
They taught societies what to expect. They taught societies what to notice. They taught societies what to remember. Women who refused marriage in Rome lived at the margins of this design. Their lives illuminate its contours precisely because they did not fit neatly within it. That illumination continues. As long as marriage remains central to social organization, refusal will continue to reveal inherited assumptions. It will continue to require navigation. It will continue to prompt reinterpretation. This is not failure of progress. It is evidence of history's persistence. Rome no longer rules, but its social logic remains embedded in the foundations of Western life. Marriage, as Rome shaped it, continues to function as a quiet architecture of order. And within that architecture, the refusal of marriage remains what it has always been, a reminder, not of rebellion, but of structure.
As the narrative reaches its widest historical horizon, the significance of Roman women who refused marriage becomes clearer not through individual stories, but through patterns that repeat across time. These women were never a majority, they were never a movement, yet their presence consistently exposed how much social order depended on participation rather than consent. Rome built a system that assumed compliance as the default condition. Marriage functioned as one of its most reliable mechanisms because it aligned personal life with public stability. Women were placed within this system not as autonomous actors, but as essential components. Their refusal did not threaten Rome militarily or politically, but it challenged the logic that sustained everyday governance. The Roman response to this challenge was not eradication, but containment. Containment took many forms. Legal limitation, economic pressure, social narrative, institutional absorption, and historical erasure all worked together. None of these mechanisms needed to be dramatic. Their effectiveness came from consistency. Over time, consistency shaped expectation. Expectation shaped behavior. This model proved so successful that it survived Rome's collapse without needing to be preserved consciously. Later societies inherited Roman assumptions embedded in law, religion, and custom. Marriage remained the primary method through which women were socially situated. Refusal was still possible, but never neutral. Neutrality would have implied equivalence. Equivalence would have undermined structure. Rome avoided equivalence by preserving hierarchy between life paths. Marriage was positioned as standard. Alternatives were positioned as exceptions. This hierarchy allowed flexibility without transformation. Flexibility preserved order. The women who refused marriage therefore became indicators rather than agents of change. Their lives showed where systems bent and where they resisted. They revealed the boundaries of acceptable deviation. Those boundaries moved slowly. Even as women gained legal equality, educational access, and economic independence, marriage retained symbolic weight. It continued to signal adulthood, stability, and legitimacy. Refusal did not negate these values, but it existed alongside them, always measured in relation. Measurement sustained comparison. Comparison sustained hierarchy. Hierarchy sustained tradition. This sequence illustrates why Roman influence remains so difficult to dismantle. It operates at the level of default assumptions. Defaults do not announce themselves, they guide behavior quietly. Rome understood this intuitively. Its most enduring power lay not in coercion, but in normalization. Women who refused marriage disrupted normalization simply by existing differently. Their disruption did not overturn the system, but it required accommodation. Accommodation revealed design. Design revealed intention. The intention was stability. Across centuries, stability remained the overriding priority. Societies tolerated change, but only to the extent that core organizing principles remained intact. Marriage proved adaptable enough to survive ideological shifts while retaining function. It absorbed romance. It absorbed religion. It absorbed partnership narratives. Each absorption preserved its role as social infrastructure. Refusal, by contrast, remained structurally inconvenient. That inconvenience explains why refusal has often been framed as personal choice rather than social position. Framing refusal as individual preference isolates it from structural critique. It prevents accumulation. Rome did the same. By treating unmarried women as isolated cases rather than systemic alternatives, it avoided reconsidering its foundations. Later societies repeated this approach. This repetition reveals how power sustains itself through framing rather than force. The story of Roman women who refused marriage therefore matters not because of what they achieved, but because of what they revealed. They showed that marriage was never merely private, it was a tool of organization. They showed that refusal was never merely personal, it was structurally significant. They showed that societies respond to significance by designing around it. Rome's design endured because it balanced rigidity with tolerance. It allowed enough deviation to prevent rupture while preserving hierarchy. That balance remains visible today. Modern societies celebrate choice yet organize life around familiar structures. Marriage persists not because it is compulsory, but because it is convenient for systems that value predictability. Women who refuse marriage continue to navigate this reality. Their lives demonstrate how history operates through persistence rather than decree. The Roman Empire no longer legislates behavior, but its social architecture remains present in everyday life. It shapes expectations, organizes resources, and influences memory. Marriage, as Rome refined it, continues to function as a stabilizing framework. Refusal continues to function as contrast. Contrast maintains clarity. Clarity maintains order. This is the quiet legacy of Rome. Not domination, not spectacle, but structure. And within that structure, the women who refused marriage remain essential figures, not because they overturned history, but because they illuminate how it continues.
As the narrative approaches its final historical layer, the significance of refusal becomes less about individual women and more about the systems that surrounded them. Roman society did not collapse because some women refused marriage. Instead, it absorbed refusal in ways that preserved continuity. This capacity for absorption explains why Roman social logic remained influential long after Roman political power disappeared. The Roman world treated marriage as infrastructure. Like roads or aqueducts, it was designed to support the flow of property, authority, and population. Women were essential to this infrastructure, not as independent agents, but as stabilizing elements within households. Refusal disrupted flow. Rome responded by redirecting pressure rather than dismantling design. This redirection shaped centuries of social organization. As post-Roman societies developed, they inherited Roman household assumptions almost unconsciously. Legal systems evolved, but household norms persisted. Marriage continued to anchor inheritance, caregiving, and legitimacy. Women who refused marriage did not disappear, but their social positioning remained unresolved. Unresolved positions generate management strategies. These strategies included framing refusal as temporary, exceptional, or compensatory. A woman might be tolerated as unmarried if she fulfilled another socially useful role: caregiver, religious devotee, patron, worker, or intellectual. Usefulness became justification. Rome had pioneered this logic. In Roman society, a woman who did not marry needed explanation. Her life had to be placed within an acceptable narrative. That requirement survived into later centuries, even when the narratives themselves changed. Narratives replaced law. This shift made the system harder to challenge. Laws can be repealed. Narratives persist. Modern societies often present marriage as one option among many, yet the distribution of resources and recognition still reflect older priorities. Married households frequently receive structural advantages simply because systems are designed around them. Unmarried women navigate these systems through adaptation rather than entitlement. Adaptation demands effort. Effort functions as quiet pressure. This is the refined form of Roman influence. Rome rarely relied on dramatic punishment, it relied on friction. It created environments where deviation required more work than compliance. Over time, most people chose the path of least resistance. That pattern remains visible. Women who refuse marriage today may do so freely, but they still encounter friction embedded in institutional design. Housing markets, healthcare assumptions, social rituals, and even workplace cultures often presume partnership. These presumptions are not malicious, they are inherited. Inheritance is powerful precisely because it is unnoticed. The Roman Empire shaped not only laws, but habits of thought. It trained societies to associate order with certain arrangements. Marriage became one of those arrangements. Its endurance lies in its adaptability. It adapted to religion by becoming sacred. It adapted to modernity by becoming personal. It adapted to equality by becoming partnership. At each stage, function survived. Refusal never disappeared, but it remained peripheral. Peripheral positions illuminate center structures. By observing how refusal is managed, one can see what a society values most. Rome valued continuity, predictability, and hierarchy. Marriage served all three. Women's participation was therefore non-negotiable in design, even when negotiable in practice. This distinction matters. Rome did not require universal compliance. It required enough compliance to maintain order. Exceptions were acceptable as long as they did not multiply or demand equivalence. Modern societies operate similarly. Marriage remains dominant not because alternatives are suppressed, but because alternatives are framed as secondary. Secondary status limits accumulation. It prevents systemic change. The women who refused marriage in Rome lived with the earliest version of this limitation. Their lives unfolded at the edges of a system that would outlast them, their empire, and their era. Their story is not one of dramatic resistance. It is a story of structure, and structure, once built well, rarely disappears.
In the end, the story of Roman women who refused marriage is not defined by a single punishment or a single outcome. It is defined by the system itself. Ancient Rome did not need to destroy refusal openly. It only needed to make refusal difficult enough that it remained rare, costly, and socially peripheral. Marriage in Rome was never simply a personal arrangement. It was a mechanism of governance. It organized inheritance, stabilized households, ensured legitimate citizenship, and maintained social continuity. Women were central to this mechanism, not because Rome valued their autonomy, but because Rome depended on their participation. Refusal exposed this dependence. Rome responded through design rather than spectacle. Legal limitations, economic disadvantages, guardianship structures, and cultural narratives all worked together to narrow the space in which an unmarried woman could exist without explanation. The system did not require dramatic enforcement because it was built into everyday life. That design outlived the empire. As Rome transformed into medieval Europe, as pagan law became Christian morality, as feudal economies became industrial societies, the underlying structure endured. Marriage remained the default framework through which women were socially situated. Alternatives existed, but rarely as equivalents. Refusal continued to require navigation, justification, and adaptation. This continuity reveals Rome's most lasting influence. Not conquest, not monuments, but normalization. The Roman world shaped expectations so deeply that later societies inherited them as common sense. Marriage became infrastructure, embedded into institutions, memory, and social recognition. Women who refused marriage, both in Rome and in the centuries that followed, illuminated the boundaries of that infrastructure simply by standing outside it. Their story is therefore not only ancient history, it is a long historical pattern. A pattern of how societies organize private life for public stability. A pattern of how norms persist through adaptation. A pattern of how structure survives even when its origins are forgotten. Roman women who refused marriage were never the center of Rome's narrative, but they reveal Rome's architecture more clearly than its triumphs ever could. Their lives show that the most powerful systems are not those enforced loudly, but those embedded quietly. And that is why their story remains significant. Because Rome is gone, but its structures remain.